Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our channel, AI Era, Islamic and Abrahamic Wisdom.
We're so glad you could join us.
If you enjoy these deep dives into history and law, please do subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. It really helps us continue this work.
It absolutely does.
Today we are diving into a monumental source. Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's exhaustive work, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence.
We're focusing specifically on Volume 1, Sub-Volume 3, which details the governance of Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab.
And our mission for this deep dive is laser-focused on one particular case study from that volume, Case 7.
That's right. This is, you could say, the ultimate constitutional test.
Yeah.
The establishment of the Emergency Constitutional Powers Framework during the Famine of 18 AH.
An event known to history, chillingly, as al-Ramādah, the Year of Ashes.
The Year of Ashes.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. This isn't just a history lesson for the sake of history. This is really a study in crisis governance, in legal philosophy. We're asking a question that, frankly, plagues every single modern government today. How does a constitutional framework survive when society itself faces a true existential collapse?
And maybe more to the point, how can a ruler exercise necessary, extraordinary emergency power without that power becoming permanent, without sliding into tyranny?
That is the core conflict. That's the whole ballgame.
It is, and the source material here, it provides what is essentially a blueprint for what we might call bounded emergency constitutional powers. It's a historical answer to that very dilemma. How do you get efficiency in a crisis without sacrificing justice?
That distinction-bounded power, that's everything, isn't it? Because the ultimate test of any system of governance, it's not found in times of comfort or prosperity.
No, absolutely not.
It's found in genuine crisis, when you are facing mass starvation, a total market collapse, and public order is just trembling on the brink.
Yeah.
That is when you see what your constitution is really made of.
To really understand the response, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of the devastation in 18 AH, or 639 CE. This wasn't just, a bad harvest that made food a bit more expensive.
No, this was something else entirely.
This was a region-wide environmental catastrophe. A catastrophic, prolonged drought gripped the Arabian Peninsula for months and months on end.
The name itself, al-Ramādah, the Year of Ashes, it just conjures this image of a landscape that was literally blackened, scorched, lifeless.
It was. The sources describe the sky darkening, not with rain clouds, which everyone was praying for, but with dust, with this arid, suffocating heat.
And the economic and social fallout from that.
Absolute. We're talking about massive livestock death. Camels, goats, sheep. These weren't just animals. This was the primary source of wealth, of transport, and crucially, of protein for everyone.
The entire pastoral economy.
It just vanished. Food production crashed to practically zero. Any supplies that were left were, of course, quickly hoarded by those who could. Prices soared to heights that made basic just getting enough calories to live, completely unattainable for, probably 90% of the population.
And this wasn't a contained problem, affecting a few villages here and there.
Not at all. The crisis generated a massive internal migration, a humanitarian crisis on a scale that was, unprecedented. Huge numbers of desperate people started flooding into the relative security of Medina, just seeking any form of relief, any chance of survival.
So that influx, that's the moment a natural disaster becomes a constitutional problem, a political problem.
Exactly. We have to elevate this discussion from just being about hunger to what it really was, a systemic attack on the very legitimacy of the state. Famine, in this sense, it directly assaults the Maqad, the foundational objectives of the entire legal system.
Explain that a bit more, because for the average person, the problem is just logistical, right? There isn't enough food. How does that attack the foundations of law?
Because the state's primary function, its reason for being, is protection. First and foremost, the right to life is under direct existential attack. If a state cannot protect the basic survival of its citizens from a shock like this, it has failed its very first non-negotiable duty.
And when life is under threat, all the other systems, they just start to crumble.
Precisely. The threat immediately compromises economic stability. The market doesn't just get a little expensive, it breaks down completely. Scarcity gets weaponized.
Now you get profiteering, hoarding, black markets.
Right. And all of that replaces legitimate exchange. It completely destroys the social contract that's based on, fair trade and access.
And the breakdown of the economy inevitably leads to the breakdown of order. It's a domino effect.
Absolutely. The risk of what you could call necessary crime theft for survival disorder and just just total despair. It just heightens exponentially. People are pushed to desperate acts.
And this is where it becomes politically dangerous for the leadership.
Hugely. It directly challenges state legitimacy. Rulers are judged, fundamentally, by their ability to keep their people alive. If the poor are dying in droves while the wealthy survive by hoarding or by using their connections, it exposes a profound systemic failure.
It just shreds the principle of equality. It reveals a system that, when push comes to shove, protects property over people.
And that is the very heart of the constitutional crisis. The environment of the famine made it impossible to just rely on business as usual laws. The source material highlights two typical and catastrophic paths that governments usually take in these situations. Both lead to failure.
The classic dichotomy of failure. What were those two paths that Umar deliberately avoided?
Okay, so path one is brutality. This is the authoritarian impulse. The state gets terrified of losing control, so it starts punishing the desperate.
Right, arresting people for stealing bread.
Exactly. Protecting the powerful who are hoarding goods, enforcing order with an iron fist, but completely ignoring the context of starvation. That response transforms the state into a tyrant because it's actively choosing property rights over the right to life.
And the second path, which is probably more common, especially in early states.
Collapse. Just paralysis. The government is simply overwhelmed. It loses control. It fails to coordinate its resources, and it just lets society descend into chaos because it's afraid to exercise the authority necessary to intervene.
So Umar's response was this revolutionary third path.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about managing hunger. It was a constitutional innovation.
Indeed. The third path was this: emergency power under law and mercy under constitutional discipline. This is the crucial takeaway. He didn't claim unlimited absolute authority. He claimed necessary authority, but he limited it strictly, legally, and ethically by the core principle of justice.
So he immediately established this model of bounded emergency powers.
Yes. Power that had to be effective enough to save lives, but which had predefined legal and ethical boundaries set from the very moment it was activated.
Okay, so this is where the legal architecture comes in. It's not just an executive order saying, I'm in charge. It's the creation of a legal framework for the intervention. And the core doctrine used here is itaruda, or necessity. For you, the listener, what is the operational definition of urida that kept this from becoming an authoritarian power grab?
So, URA is a central legal doctrine that allows for a temporary and limited departure from normal rules. The principle he applied is incredibly restrained. It's basically this: necessity permits exceptional measures, but only to the extent necessary and only for the duration required.
So that's the principle of proportionality, right? Something modern legal scholars are always fighting to uphold in crises.
It is, in its essence. If the crisis is so severe that you have to set aside, say, a specific property law to ensure survival, you can do that. But you can only set aside that rule, and only until the necessity passes.
You don't get a blank check. You don't suddenly get to change election laws or suppress political dissent because there's a famine.
Precisely. And this is the guardrail against tyranny. The emergency actions had to meet 3 explicit and very strict criteria to remain legitimate.
Let's break those down because they're the constitutional glue holding this whole thing together.
First, they had to be temporary. They automatically had what you might call a metaphorical sunset clause. This power was tied explicitly to the famine. The moment the rains returned and the supply lines were restored, the emergency powers automatically expired. Normal rule of law resumed.
That's a critical check.
Yeah.
It prevents the state of exception from just becoming the permanent rule.
Yes, and that leads to the second criteria. They had to be strictly purpose-limited. The authority could only be used to address the immediate symptoms of the famine.
So food distribution, supply line security, public order related to starvation.
That's it. It could not, for example, be used to settle old political scores or reorganize regional governorships for political advantage. The scope of the authority was defined by the scope of the crisis itself.
And the third criteria, which I think is where a lot of modern systems fail, speaks directly to ethical leadership.
The third, and maybe the most vital check: the emergency measures must be explicitly not used for personal or political gain. Any official, from a local administrator all the way up to the caliph himself, who was found to be profiting from the crisis, they would immediately forfeit the legitimacy of the entire operation.
So it's a system designed for a sunset-limited emergency state. You gain efficiency, but the ethical limits are actually magnified, not relaxed.
It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? The legal framework demanded a higher standard of conduct during the emergency, not a lower one.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
So this power wasn't just limited, it was channeled. And that brings us to the 5 defined objectives you mentioned. These are the goals.
Yes, and they weren't random. They were the measurable success criteria, and they align perfectly with the McCoy, the established constitutional objectives of the law.
So what was objective number 1? Has to be more than just feed people.
It is. Objective 1, preserve life. That's the absolute non-negotiable priority. Every single action, every legal adjustment, every administrative decision flowed from that.
Okay, that's the foundation. What's next?
Immediately following that is maintaining the system itself, prevent the collapse of public order. This meant managing the despair and frustration, providing enough structure and hope so that the distribution system could actually function without being overrun by mobs or chaos.
Makes sense. If people believe the state is trying to save them, they're more likely to cooperate. If they feel abandoned, order just vanishes.
Exactly. Now, the third objective is exceptionally insightful. Protect the dignity of the suffering population. Yes. The source material makes it clear that relief cannot be humiliating or degrading. People are already at their lowest point. The state must ensure that providing food preserves their human honor. This meant organized, clean camps and treating refugees not as burdens, but as citizens in distress.
Wow. Protecting dignity is often the first thing that goes out the window during massive humanitarian crises today. Sheer speed often trumps humane treatment.
Indeed. Fourth was to stabilize markets, and this is a very surgical intervention. The goal was preventing profiteering and hoarding, making sure that the necessary infrastructure for supply remained intact, even while the state was intervening so heavily in distribution. The goal was to restore the market, not permanently replace it.
And the 5th and final objective.
Maintain institutional accountability. This is crucial. The state's extraordinary response must itself be governed by rules, by oversight, and by transparent record-keeping.
So these goals guided the entire state response. How comprehensive was this activation?
It was total. It signaled a shift from, passive governance to active constitutional emergency governance. We see the caliph taking direct daily command, that's the central coordination. There was interprovincial mobilization, which we can get into. And then the most revolutionary aspect, the legal adjustments to criminal enforcement.
The suspension of the fixed punishments, the hudud.
That's the one, and it required profound jurisprudential justification.
This is really the intellectual core of this deep dive. You have a crisis that forces a collision between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice.
That's a great way to put it.
Famine inevitably drives up crimes of desperation, especially theft. Now, if a state is dedicated to the rule of law, it has to enforce its laws, especially those with fixed punishments. But Umar suspended the head punishment for theft.
And this action requires the deepest examination because it demonstrates the profound flexibility and justice orientation in Islamic law when it's applied by a sophisticated legal mind.
The tension is immense. If systemic deprivation pushes someone to steal food just to survive, does enforcing the fixed punishment uphold justice, or does it commit a secondary injustice?
In a purely mechanical system, the answer is simple. Theft occurred, the punishment applies. End of story. But Umar effectively said, wait, the context here might void the conditions for that punishment.
He didn't ask, did they steal? He asked, was the state's failure to provide a safety net the primary driver here?
Exactly. And did that failure create a legal doubt about the criminal intent? This is where we introduce a key legal principle, Shupat al-Dura, the doubt of necessity.
The doubt of necessity. That's the legal shield, isn't it? How does extreme hunger create a legal doubt that stops a punishment?
Because Islamic law holds that for the had punishment for theft to apply, the intent has to be purely malicious. It has to be an attack on property under conditions of general safety and sufficiency. The severity of the penalty demands absolute certainty that the crime was driven by greed, not by need.
And when extreme hunger, kurura, is present,
that certainty is destroyed. The act is no longer purely malicious theft. It's an act of self-preservation. And that introduces a legal doubt, a shubha. And in Islamic law, fixed punishments, hudud, are averted by the presence of doubt.
So the state admitting that conditions are so bad that people are starving is, in a legal sense, admitting that it can't guarantee the conditions necessary to enforce its harshest penalties.
Precisely. The rule of law mandates that a punishment only applies when the full stack of conditions for that punishment are met. If even one precondition is missing, especially one related to social justice, the punishment is suspended.
So what were those specific missing preconditions in the famine?
Okay, first, there's the question of intention. Was the act driven by survival or by pure malice? In a famine, the burden of proof has to shift. The default assumption must lean towards necessity.
Makes sense. What's the second?
The second, and this is the constitutional linchpin, is the security of basic needs. The state has a foundational, non-negotiable duty to ensure essentials: food, water, shelter. If the state has failed in that fundamental duty, how can it then punish a person for seeking those essentials outside the law?
It's a moral and legal contradiction. The state is partially culpable for the conditions that drove the crime.
Right. Umar recognized this. Punishing a starving man for stealing grain, when the state was failing to get that grain to him effectively, would turn justice into hypocrisy.
And the third condition?
The absence of coercive necessity. Extreme hunger is a coercive force. The priority to save your own life overrides the right to property in such an extreme case. Why? Because the goal of preserving life, hifz al-nafs, is higher in the hierarchy of legal objectives than the goal of preserving property, hifz al-mal.
So Umar realized that punishing the desperate wouldn't be justice. It would be a secondary, tyrannical injustice layered on top of the primary injustice of mass starvation.
He prioritized the higher constitutional objective, preserving life.
This is the core insight, then. The suspension wasn't an act of softness or just bending the law for a bit. It was an act of a superior rule of law. It was an application of jurisprudence that elevated context over the mechanical letter of the statute.
It proved that the legal system is dynamic, that it's rooted in the higher goal of justice, not rigid mechanisms. It showed that the constitutional environment for enforcing criminal law, one of social justice, equitable distribution, basic needs being met, that environment has to exist before the harshest punishments can be applied.
So he basically codified the idea that social justice is a necessary precondition for criminal justice. If your system creates absolute desperation, it relinquishes its right to enact absolute punishment. That's a profound realization for any society, even today.
Absolutely. So moving from that legal theory to the practical reality, the administrative effort to manage this famine was just colossal. The key shift here is that relief was immediately transformed from informal charity into a formal emergency public administration. It became a constitutional duty of the state, coordinated from the very top.
So the government was explicitly taking operational responsibility for mass survival, not just, asking people to donate more. What did this centralized relief look like on the ground for the thousands of refugees pouring into Medina?
It was incredibly systematic for the 7th century. Umar implemented several key components. He established centralized distribution camps, especially around Medina. Crucially, these camps organized systematic cooking and food provision.
Wait, prepared meals, not just handing out sacks of grain. That adds a huge layer of logistical difficulty.
It does, but think about why. It ensures efficiency. It reduces the need for refugees to forage for scarce fuel and water. And it guarantees equitable distribution of prepared food, which is especially important for the weakest, the elderly, the sick, children, widows who couldn't cook for themselves.
That's a level of planning that's astonishing. And that implies bureaucracy.
It does. And bureaucracy means record-keeping, even in an emergency.
They were keeping records.
Meticulous records of households' independence. This is critical for internal accountability, for preventing people from double-dipping, and for ensuring equity. They had explicit rules for prioritizing the most vulnerable. Children, widows, the elderly were always first in line.
So welfare became a disciplined, auditable, administrative process.
Coordinated through the Bayt al-Mal, the state treasury, and mandated through explicit provincial support. The crisis wasn't just in the capital, so the system had to function across vast distances.
Right. The source material highlights this interprovincial mobilization, which speaks to the federal resource authority that Umar exercised. He was commanding the resources of the entire state.
This is the moment the crisis tested and proved the strength of the state's federal structure. Umar requested and mandated the shipment of supplies from the major productive regions that had escaped the drought: Syria, Iraq, and Egypt.
And this wasn't a plea for charity.
No, it was an ordered transfer of strategic resources. It was treating the entire body politic as one economic and social unit responsible for its weakest part.
That takes immense political capital. You're essentially declaring an emergency economic mandate across a federal network, prioritizing survival in one region over the normal economic flow and profit of 3 others.
And that is precisely where the system of disciplined federalism was so vital. The transfer of these resources, grain, dried meat, livestock, was tracked, it was monitored, and it was disciplined.
Okay, but historically, When a government takes over supply lines on this scale, corruption just explodes. Governors have a massive opportunity to divert grain meant for the starving into the black market. How did he stop that?
He had two primary mechanisms. First, the resource orders were specific. They demanded not just what, but how much, and this was tracked against what a province could reasonably produce. So there's accountability before anything was even shipped.
1 second.
And second, crucially, accountability officers were sent out to monitor the loading, the transit, and the unloading processes. Misuse or diversion of resources was actively investigated and punished severely.
So transparency was built directly into the process. The supplies arriving from Egypt, for instance, weren't seen as a gift from the Egyptian governor, but as a mandatory tracked constitutional duty to the center.
Exactly. And this strict monitoring ensured that this huge expansion of central power was a reliable tool of survival, not an opportunity for corruption. It proved the system's fairness across the federal landscape, strengthening the idea that the caliphate was an organization that could actually deliver justice and survival.
Okay, so let's shift to the economy. When a crisis hits the food supply, the market becomes ground zero for moral and economic failure. We've talked about hoarding, profiteering, artificial scarcity. If you just let the market run wild, the poor die.
And the market itself loses all moral standing. The challenge for Umar's economic governance model was navigating this without just destroying the market entirely, because total rigid price controls, as we know from history, often just lead to shortages because producers won't bring goods to market.
So what was the balance? What was the intervention?
The intervention focused on managing the quantity and the flow of goods rather than just slapping maximum prices on everything. The state ensured smooth supply lines by taking direct control of the transit of those vast quantities of grain coming from Syria and Egypt.
And that grain was for public distribution, so it was removed from the speculative market.
Precisely. By doing that, the state's massive injection of supply completely undercut the speculators. They actively discouraged hoarding by making it unprofitable. Why hoard grain if the state is guaranteeing a continuous high volume of supply and ensuring distribution?
And by regulating that distribution through the camps and the centralists, they ensured equity.
Yes. This stabilized prices not by fixing them at some arbitrary low level, but by increasing the overall supply through massive state intervention. And the key takeaway here is vital, even for modern economics. He didn't destroy the market's structure. He protected the market from moral collapse.
He made it subservient to the common good during a state of maximum duress.
Which is the only way it could regain legitimacy after the famine.
Let's pivot to the highest standards set by this crisis, Umar's personal conduct. The source material frames his leadership's self-sacrifice, not as some nice symbolic gesture, but as a core constitutional requirement for legitimacy.
Because it's the political prerequisite for effectiveness. In a crisis this bad, legitimacy is incredibly fragile. If the ruler is seen eating well, enjoying luxuries, failing to share the burden, every administrative effort is just going to be viewed with cynicism and resentment.
So Umar set the standard. The ruler must visibly share the burden before demanding patience and cooperation from the people.
The accounts are just so vivid. They detail how he publicly restricted his own diet. He refused olive oil, butter, and meat. He chose to eat only bread and vinegar, or maybe bread with a little oil and salt. He was deliberately living like those who were suffering the most.
And this wasn't a private penance. It was a public declaration of solidarity.
A deliberate act of political equity. And its effect was tangible. It functionally strengthened trust. It drastically reduced resentment. It generated patience among the population, which is absolutely crucial for maintaining public order without having to resort to brutality.
When people saw the caliph himself was suffering alongside them,
they were more likely to accept the hardship as a shared fate, rather than viewing it as administrative failure or elite greed.
It's hard to imagine a modern leader achieving that level of ascetic solidarity. The political gravity of that decision, to restrict his own caloric intake during a period of such high stress, is immense.
It speaks volumes about the standard of ethical governance he established. And finally, even in all that chaos, all that pressure, he preserved administrative discipline.
What does that mean in practice? Doesn't the need for speed usually mean you ditch the bureaucracy for a while?
It means that the expanded power of the state was paired with expanded accountability. Oversight was mandatory. Accountability officers monitored relief efforts to ensure supplies reached the intended people. Crucially, established complaint channels were preserved and heard. The desperate had a recognized place to voice grievances that were taken seriously.
So the message was clear.
The message was, Emergency means law applied to survival, not a green light for lawlessness or unaccountability.
When we look at this 7th century case study, it's striking how the structural elements of emergency governance are. Well, they're universal. Modern constitutions all over the world include emergency provisions, disaster authority, temporary suspensions, emergency budgets.
The structure is similar, no question.
But where do modern systems, whether they're democracies or other forms of governance, so often fail when facing large-scale crises like pandemics or natural disasters?
They fail exactly where Umar's framework placed its strongest guardrails. They fail when the state of emergency becomes a cover for authoritarianism, when the legal limitations are ignored.
The sunset clause gets forgotten, and temporary powers become permanent fixtures of the state.
Exactly. Accountability gets suspended indefinitely in the name of efficiency or security, and leaders completely fail to share the economic and social burdens of the crisis. The moment the power is extended for reasons other than the original necessity, the system risks total moral and constitutional collapse.
So the lessons from Umar's model, they really stand as this historical benchmark. Let's summarize the core constitutional principles here. What are the big takeaways?
I think there are four. First, emergency power must be strictly purpose-limited. If the crisis is starvation, the power is about food, not about anything else.
Second, mercy must remain a legal and constitutional principle. Justice isn't just blind, mechanical enforcement. It has to be contextual, humane, rooted in preserving life and dignity.
Third, and maybe the most revolutionary, punishment must be contingent on social justice. If the state fails to provide the basic environment of justice, security of basic needs, it forfeits its moral and legal right to enact the severest punishments. That's Shupat al-Dawra in action.
And fourth, the hardest one to maintain. Accountability must continue even during high-pressure events. A crisis doesn't excuse corruption. It demands expanded oversight.
This framework has immense relevance today for societies facing floods, economic shocks, hyperinflation, refugee crises.
It sets a non-negotiable standard. The state's constitutional obligation is to actively protect life first. Welfare is an act of state duty, not optional charity.
And it reminds legislators everywhere that the application of severe legal penalties requires the underlying social justice conditions to be met first. You cannot credibly punish a person for a crime of desperation when the state has failed its primary duty to ensure their survival.
It just demonstrates that effective governance can be immensely powerful and decisive without being oppressive. But only if that power is chained to the rule of law and true ethical leadership.
The Year of Ashes was an existential threat. It could have done more than just cause mass death. It could have shattered the trust between the ruler and the ruled, destroying the nascent Islamic State.
But instead, it became the crucible that proved its constitutional maturity.
Umar didn't rule by panic. He ruled by the strict doctrine of necessity, akira. By disciplined coordination, stringent public accountability, and a profound mercy, applying the highest principles of the law when the pressure was at its absolute greatest.
He demonstrated that the highest form of authority isn't domination or control, but the unwavering protection of the weakest.
So what does this all mean for you today? The final provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. Reflect on the profound idea that when hunger rose, Umar raised justice higher.
How should leaders today, when they face massive crises of economics or climate or public health, prioritize justice, and specifically the provision of basic needs, over their own political survival or simple economic expediency?
That is the real, enduring constitutional test this 7th century framework provides.
We invite you to consider that reflection as we wrap up this deep dive. Join us next time for our next exploration, where we'll move from managing famine to institutional oversight, examining Case 8, the Administrative Accountability Department, the first structured anti-corruption investigations.
You know you won't want to miss that one.
We'll see you then.